A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is very much the story of its titular character, Ser Duncan the Tall, and his young squire Egg, and their adventures up and down the Seven Kingdoms. We see Westeros through a very different lens than the main book series, by having this singular viewpoint, which really changes the dynamic of the story. So yeah, it is Duncan Egg's story. Well, on the surface it is. When you take a step back and look at the wider context of the history of Westeros, it's just as much the story of how war can fracture and divide a people, how the scars left by that war can run deep, causing generational resentment. War being bad isn't something new in George R. R. Martin's work. The message is there in A Song of Ice and Fire, and even dating back to some of his earliest published material. Many of his stories deal with the themes and ideas that are present in A Song of Ice and Fire. So yeah, war is generally bad, but civil war is another matter altogether, because your enemy isn't this stranger from a foreign land, but your brother or cousin or a close friend. Civil war divides a kingdom in a way a normal war doesn't, and those scars it leaves behind can carry through generations. This is the environment Ser Duncan the Tall lives in. Westeros is still healing from the divisions of the First Blackfyre Rebellion, and while there is peace, that division still runs deep. The wounds are still open, and there's an underlying sense of trepidation and distrust of what could happen should the Black Dragon rear its head once more. So in my view, what is often deeply overlooked when talking about Duncan Egg is the fact it's really taking place in the shadow of House Blackfyre. Of course, this is much more obvious with the second and third novellas, The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight, where the Blackfyre rebellions have a much more tangible impact to the story, but the spectre of Daemon Blackfyre lingers in the background of the Hedge Knight, and it really adds a lot of feeling and undercurrent of political tensions still at play in Westeros. So the Blackfyre element of the novellas are a key part of the setting, and setting up key plot points, even if it's not centre stage in the first novella, which will be season 1 of the show. In this video today, I want to take a look at the idea that House Blackfyre and the Rebellion could potentially play a bigger role in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1 than you might first think, and how I think they could potentially incorporate some of the Blackfyre Rebellion lore more directly into the show, as a way of building towards Season 2 and 3. The issue we have here is when talking about House Blackfyre specifically in the Hedge Knight, and thus A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1, is that no members of House Blackfyre appear in the story or even mentioned at all, despite the fact present at the tourney of Ashford Meadow is the likes of both Prince Baelor and Maekar Targaryen, whose reputations were forged by their deeds during First Blackfyre Rebellion, specifically at the Redgrass Field. So much so, they had a song named after their partnership in the battle, The Hammer and the Anvil. Many of those taking part or present at the tourney are of the right age to have taken part in the war, or had fathers or an elder brother who did. In fact, we do go on to learn that Sir Arlan Penetry himself was at the Redgrass Field. Despite the actual lack of anything Blackfyre in the Hedge Knight, it retroactively becomes a key part of it in terms of the setting of the story and the relationships between the characters. I found the lack of anything Blackfyre quite puzzling the first time I reread The Hedge Knight, with the context of the following two novellas, given how vital the Blackfyre Rebellions are to those stories. But there is a practical reason why this is the case, and why I think the TV adaptation of The Hedge Knight will be making some changes to the story to incorporate the Blackfyre Rebellions into the setting more organically. It is possible that when George R. R. Martin was initially writing The Hedge Knight in around 1997, which was approximately the same time he would have been working on A Clash of Kings, he hadn't even come up with the concept of House Blackfyre or the Rebellions. In fact, so much of the world lore and even the important Targaryen history had not been fleshed out at all. We know that sometime between writing the initial pitch letter for A Song of Ice and Fire, and we can assume when he started to write A Game of Thrones, that George wrote outlines for his world history. In fact, we have some early maps and some early notes of his attesting to this. Things like some key events that happened, the list of Targaryen kings, and what kinds of kings they were. Really broad, big picture stuff. enough history to make his world feel organic and real. As part of that, we know he got the idea of King Aegon IV, Aegon the Unworthy, being not just a bad king, an unworthy king, with a huge question over the succession at his death. Specifically, this comes from a Jon Snow chapter in A Clash of Kings, so there was a framework there to be built upon very early into the writing of the first two novels. First time Daemon Blackfyre is named is in A Storm of Swords, Davos 4. Thus, many fans believe that George R. R. Martin came up with the idea of House Blackfyre and thus the rebellions between writing A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords, which came out in the year 2000. Given how many times the Blackfyres are mentioned in that book, when you then consider that The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knights came out in 2003 and 2010, it's easy to see how the House Blackfyre elements became such a key part of their stories. I'm of the view that the First Blackfyre Rebellion has a bigger tangible impact on the history of Westeros than in fact the Dance of the Dragons, another civil war, and one much more well known by the wider fans of the series, very much thanks to Fire and Blood and House of the Dragon. But the main point here is it really depends on the lens you are viewing the topic through. Because what I'm not saying here is the Dance of the Dragons didn't have a lasting impact on Westeros. It did. But when you actually take a look at the long-term impact of the dance, while it undoubtedly devastated House Targaryen with the loss of the dragons, resulting in a distinct change in their position as kings and how they wielded power, the actual wounds of the Dance of the Dragons on Westeros and its people as a whole seem to have healed quite quickly. I think it's mostly because the outcome of the dance was one palatable to both sides of the conflict, that both factions found a workable compromise they could all get behind. And while things certainly were still very turbulent during the Regency period and the early reign of King Aegon III, the wounds did heal and the scars left behind faded. It's all very much history and a memory 90 years later by the start of the Hedge Knight. That's certainly not the case with the First Blackfyre Rebellion. The realm was cleaved in two between the Red Dragon and the Black, and the wounds it caused were still very much fresh by the time of the Hedge Knight. At the start of the novella, it's only been 13 years since the Redgrass Field. It's very debatable who won the Dance of the Dragons. It depends how you define the victory conditions. But House Targaryen certainly lost. There is clearly a winner and a loser when it comes to the First Blackfyre Rebellion. House Blackfyre was soundly defeated at the Redgrass Field. Several key generals dead. Daemon Blackfyre dead. Two of his sons also dead. The army routed. And while King Daemon II did punish the rebel lords, stripping them of titles and lands, taking hostages and so on, by rights he could have taken it a lot further than he did. Throughout Westeros there's still a large base of chastised lords who still hold these Blackfyre sympathies. The trauma of the First Blackfyre Rebellion transcends generations. Everyone lost a father, brother or son in that war, and some houses, very close friends, now coexist with an underlying tension between them, simply based on what dragon they supported. It's possible, and I suspect elements of this and the divisions between the Red and Black Dragon could make their way into the first season of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, in some form. The wounds of the Blackfyre Rebellion would take generations to heal, given how many Blackfyre Rebellions there actually were. I'm of the opinion that it's only because Robert's Rebellion that Westeros was finally able to close that chapter of its history, and that those old divisions faded into memory, and new ones arose to replace them. The spectre of Daemon Blackfyre hangs heavy over the Hedge Knight, even if there's no direct reference to it, and it all comes retroactively from the next two novellas. So my question here is how the first season of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will handle the Blackfyre aspect of the setting. HBO do not have the same issue George R. R. Martin did when he first wrote The Hedge Knight back in 1998. House Blackfyre and the lore around them has been well established by this point. It would make sense for HBO to include some sort of Blackfyre adjacent element in Season 1, even at a minimum, if it's just to lay the groundwork for viewers for Season 2 and 3. They have a chance to retroactively include references to the First Blackfyre Rebellion, and they don't even need to make any tangible changes to the source material to do this. There are two clear as day methods House Blackfyre could organically be inserted into the story. The most obvious would be to have the other knights and small folk really hype up Baelor and Maekar. You could have a few throwaway comments and lines about the hammer and the anvil during the Redgrass Field, as by this point their role in the Redgrass Field has become legendary and the stuff of singers and songs. If you want to take this even further, you could have the likes of Baelor and Maekar themselves have some sort of conversation about it. I also think given the presence of the puppet show and the mummers, which we saw in the trailer, as well as their performance of Serwyn and the Mirror Shield, we could see perhaps Tanzao and co. telling a couple of other stories. Even if it's just in the background or as a brief reference, it would be a perfect way to subtly lore dump some Blackfyre Rebellion information. The key here is it wouldn't feel too out of place and naturally fit into the story without having to really change anything. I don't think there should be this huge spotlight on the Blackfyres, because that's not what the Hedge Knight is about, but in the wider context of the 3 novellas, it would make sense to have some minor references in Season 1. What I don't want to see is the tension between people regarding the Civil War, because that's not what this story is meant to be, and is really core to the story of the Sworn Sword. I wouldn't want it to feel like Season 2, which is repeating the same themes as Season 1. I have seen 2 fan suggestions that take this retroactive inclusion of Blackfyre elements in Season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms maybe a step too far. It depends how you look at it. From what I can tell from the comments on some of my videos and some comments about the trailer on Twitter and Reddit, there seems to be a large amount of people who believe we will get a flashback to the Redgrass Field in Season 1. The argument being that there's no large battles in the Hedge Knight and HBO will be concerned viewers will thus not be as interested in the show without what they mistakenly think viewers want from the likes of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, dragons and battles, when really it's a lot deeper than that, and is why later seasons of Game of Thrones kind of lost its soul. I'm sort of 50-50 as to if I think this could happen. I can see why they'd be keen to do it, but there are 3 reasons I think they will not. Firstly, it would really take away from the impact of perhaps seeing the Redgrass Field in Season 2, where it would fit much more naturally as a flashback than it would in the Hedge Knight. Secondly, the Hedge Knight has a very specific tone and feel to it as a story, one that I don't think would naturally fit a flashback sequence. Finally, even if you have a brief flashback to a large set-piece battle, I think it ultimately takes away from the action that exists already in the Hedge Knight, and what is at the very core of the story, the tourney itself, and the Trial of 7. The Trial of 7 is what the whole season is going to be building up to, and while no, it's not this huge grand set-piece battle, given what happens in it and how brutal it was, it can stand on its own and surprise the viewers. If the writers do a good job fleshing out all the characters involved in the trial, there could potentially be maybe 14 characters fans either care about or despise facing off. They could be hugely invested in it. I put forward it's much more dramatic and a meaningful conflict than a random flashback to the Redgrass Field that most viewers don't know about at this stage and don't care about. The reason a lot of people care about the battles in Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon is because they care about the characters involved in them. There has also been a lot of people speculating they will involve Bloodraven in Season 1 in some capacity. This seems to have mostly been fueled by his cameo in House of the Dragon Season 2, but I'm not 100% against this idea if it's done the right way. Some have suggested, given his background, Bloodraven could be present at the tourney, in disguise, but I'm not really sure how that would work functionally. You could maybe have him arrive with Maekar, but I'm not sure how this would make sense without spelling out to the audience who he is. I'm not a huge fan of injecting him into the story this way. I suspect if we do get Bloodraven at all in Season 1, it will be straightforward cameo. There has been some speculation on places such as Reddit that based on some of the casting calls that came out last year, we could get a flashback to Dunk's childhood in King's Landing. This could take many forms. Maybe Sir Arlen Pennytree finding and taking Dunk on as his squire. But when I read the casting call, to me it sounded like they could be one of Dunk's childhood friends like Ferret, Rafe and Pudding. So perhaps they could be involved in whatever this possible flashback is. Or, even more likely, they could be 3 random kids at the tourney of Ashford Meadow. But the reason I bring this up is some have suggested this flashback could simply be Dunk and his friends seeing Bloodraven and the Raven's Teeth in the streets of King's Landing. If we do indeed get a flashback, I would not be against including Bloodraven in this way, as a simple cameo that fits in to what's already established about the story. But I would be extremely surprised if he was in Season 1 at all, let alone in any larger capacity than this. The Dunk and Egg novellas are maybe my favourite parts of George R. R. Martin's writing, and I might go as far as saying maybe even his best work. As a book fan, I'm always on the side of a true and faithful adaptation of the source material, where it's possible. The Hedge Knight is a very simple story to adapt when compared to the main book series, and even Fire and Blood, which had to fill in so many gaps. So the showrunners and HBO have absolutely no excuse for missing the mark on this occasion. But saying that, I am open to additions that, while adding to the story, don't drastically change it. I think adding in some more Blackfyre context into the first season of the show that was missing from the book due to the timeline of George's writing is a reasonable idea, and would help keep continuity with seasons 2 and 3 of the show. Some of the best scenes in Game of Thrones Season 1 were scenes that Benioff and Weiss added in. In a sense, these scenes elevated the season by working within the context of what was already being adapted, which is surprising given how drastically Benioff and Weiss's writing declined as seasons progressed. Because as we learn from Game of Thrones, these kind of things have very fine margins. So if they do make any additions to Season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms with new content, they really have to tread very carefully when doing so, given how the Hedge Knight is this self-contained, finished story. How do you think A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will handle the First Blackfyre Rebellion, and characters such as Bloodraven? Will they try and weave them into Season 1? Do you even want to see them do this?